when Dana White entered the stage of one of the most watched talk shows in the country. Everyone expected another routine debate, but the young presenter was wrong to try to corner him. Instead of defending himself, Dana took the reins. And what followed would change the discussion about freedom of expression forever. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and ring the bell to be notified whenever there are new stories on the channel. The station's studio was in Charlotte, North Carolina, a city known for mixing the conservative air of the countryside with the modern trends of a large urban center. People crowded into the lobby, waiting for the start of one of the most talked about programs on American television, the talk show Late Night with Alice Robinson, hosted by liberal journalist Alice Robinson. Famous for her incisive interviews and for cornering public figures who defended Republican agendas, Alice had a big target that night: Dana White. Dana White, nationally recognized for his firm stance in the world of combat sports, was also a staunch defender of freedom of expression. There were those who criticized him for his ties to Republican politicians and his tough talk against the culture of cancellation, but his charisma was undeniable. For many, Dana was a symbol of someone who doesn't submit to outside pressure and always speaks his mind. The production team ran through the corridors, setting up cameras and microphones, while spectators took their seats around the circular stage. In the center, two chairs faced each other. On one side, Alice's, a light leather armchair with chrome details in a modern style, and on the other, Dana's, a slightly more sober seat, but equally highlighted by the bright studio lights. As soon as the recording lights began to flicker, Alice adjusted the dark blazer she was wearing. She flashed a calculated smile at the camera. The program's vignette resounded through the speakers, giving way to a round of applause. That was the cue. "Good evening, America," announced Alice in her firm, captivating voice. Today, on Late Night with Alice Robinson, we're going to welcome a controversial personality, admired by many, questioned by others, but who certainly doesn't leave anyone indifferent. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, Dana White. The audience erupted into applause. Some, more enthusiastic, shouted Dana's name. Others remained restrained, waiting to see how the conversation would unfold. Dana entered the stage quietly, wearing a simple jacket and dark slacks. She greeted Alice with a firm handshake and a polite smile, but without exaggeration. As he sat down, he could see a gleam of expectation in Alice's expression, as if she was anxiously awaiting the right moment to make her move. "Mr. White, welcome to our show. It's a pleasure to have you here," Alice began, leaning back in her armchair with apparent tranquility. "It's my pleasure, Alice. Thank you for inviting me," Dana replied, her deep voice echoing through the studio. The host wasted no time and fired the first question. "Dana, you are known for defending freedom of expression tooth and nail, going so far as to say that we are living in an era of veiled censorship. Some liberals and Democrats consider your speeches extreme, saying that you promote a discourse that actually silences minorities and incites hate speech. What do you have to say about that?" The audience, mostly made up of young liberals, reacted with approving murmurs. They expected an angry response, perhaps even an aggressive one. But Dana remained calm. "I find it interesting that you say that my speeches silence minorities. The real minority that is being silenced today is the one that disagrees with certain policies, Alice. I believe that freedom of speech is a fundamental right in this country, something that Republicans have made a priority. But when someone disagrees with progressive views, they run the risk of being cancelled or labelled an extremist." He paused briefly. "You know what's really dangerous? It's when we come to accept that certain voices must be silenced in the name of a greater good." A small group in the audience applauded. Alice, keeping her composure, asked another question. "So you set yourself up as a victim of supposed censorship? You're a public figure with space in the media, on social networks. You have connections in the Republican political milieu. Is it really honest to say that there is censorship against people like you, who have so much visibility and influence?" Dana leaned forward a little, resting her elbows on her knees. Visibility is not synonymous with freedom, Alice. I can be heard, but if every speech I give becomes the target of personal attacks, attempts to ban and boycott, something is wrong with our public debate. I'm not saying there shouldn't be criticism. All criticism is valid. What I am saying is that a toxic environment has been created where disagreements are not discussed, but labeled. That, to me, is not freedom of expression. The cameras focused on Alice, who raised her eyebrows in feigned surprise. But what would you call labeled? Society has the right to point out prejudiced speech or insults, right? Isn't it simply freedom of expression on the other side too? Dana gave a half smile. Of course, but there's a fine line between criticism and systematic persecution. Calling someone prejudiced as a way of interdicting their entire discourse is different from exposing flaws and seeking solutions together. I'm not here to advocate hatred. I'm here to say that we need to let people speak, and from there, debate ideas. If even influential democratic figures preach freedom, why are they so afraid of opposing opinions? The presenter seemed to pay extra attention, realizing that Dana would not be easily cornered. She looked away from her notes, choosing another angle of attack. Right, Dana, let's talk politics then. You've allied yourself with some famous Republicans who advocate tougher laws on public demonstrations, especially involving protests in front of establishments. Isn't it contradictory to defend freedom of expression, but support legislation that could restrict street protests? The atmosphere in the studio became more tense. Some in the audience looked at each other, waiting for the answer. Alice, demonstrating peacefully is different from destroying property or preventing other citizens from working, studying, or simply moving around freely. I'm in favor of protests, whether by liberals, conservatives, or anyone. But you can't use the banner of freedom of expression to threaten the safety of others. Freedom is not a carte blanche for chaos. So your problem is just with the methods, Alice interrupted. Don't you think that these Republican laws can directly affect minority groups who are often forced to protest more incisively in order to be heard? Dana took a deep breath, keeping her gaze steady. Freedom of speech is for everyone. Minorities, majorities, Democrats, Republicans. The difference is that I don't think it's right to use this freedom to restrict the freedom of others. There is room for dialogue and peaceful protests without the whole city being taken over by vandalism, right? The audience reacted again, now divided between applause and grumbling. Alice, feeling that she still hadn't achieved the big breakthrough, decided to insist, "All right, Dana, but there are those who say, and here I include many of the younger Democrats, that your vision is old-fashioned, almost nostalgic, for a time when minority groups had no space to express themselves. How do you respond to those who accuse you of wanting to roll back social achievements?" Dana let out a small laugh, not of derision, but of someone who had expected the question. I would say that these people need to understand the difference between social achievements and censorship of divergent opinions. I never said that minorities shouldn't express themselves. What I advocate is that everyone should have this right, including those who disagree with these agendas. Lately, it seems that defending the family, religion, or Republican values has become synonymous with fanaticism. So I ask myself, who is really intolerant here? The tension increased. A man in the audience, wearing a t-shirt with liberal slogans, stood up abruptly. "Don't say you're censored, Dana. You conservatives are in charge in several states, and now you're playing the victim. What hypocrisy." Several viewers looked at the man, expecting some reprisal from the production, but Alice, sensing that this moment could make for good video cuts, encouraged him. "Let him speak, production, please. What's your name, sir?" "My name is Mike Sanders. I'm a Democratic activist here in Charlotte." Alice nodded positively. "Right, Mike. Go ahead. I'm tired of seeing people like him." He pointed to Dana, talking about how they're being silenced, while they pass laws banning protests in front of public buildings and threaten to cut funding from universities that invite liberal speakers. They defend freedom only when it suits them. Dana turned to the man and maintained a respectful tone. "Mike, I understand your anger, But look, if you want to protest in front of a public building without causing damage and without preventing employees from entering or leaving, go ahead. The point is that some people go beyond that limit. As for universities, I'm in favor of inviting speakers from all sides, liberals, conservatives, libertarians, to foster debate. What I don't support is using public money to promote only one side of the story, without room for contradiction. Dana's speech generated murmurs among the audience. Alice, sensing the growing heat of the discussion, gestured for Mike to sit down. After a few seconds, the man gave in, shaking his head in disapproval. "Well, Dana." Alice took back the microphone. "That's the kind of reaction many people have to your speech. They see a contradiction between what you say and what the Republican Party actually does in various states. Do you think this is just a matter of misinterpretation? Interpretation and manipulation of narratives, Alice. When someone wants to call me retrograde or intolerant, they just cut out my words and throw them on the web without the full context. That's how the internet works nowadays, and many people end up believing everything they see. That's why I say that freedom of expression is under threat. If there is no honesty in the exchange of ideas, the debate becomes a field of war." This comment ignited a new buzz. Alice, biting her lip lightly, tried one last attempt to regain control. "Dana, I'm going to be blunt. A lot of people think you're a hypocrite. You talk about defending freedom of expression, but at the same time you have allied yourself with Republican politicians who have tried to prevent cultural events deemed offensive from taking place in public spaces. Isn't that also a form of censorship?" Dana blinked slowly, silent for a few moments. The audience waited in suspense. Then he smiled, almost complacently. "It depends on what you call offensive, Alice. If a cultural event promotes violence, religious or racial intolerance, it obviously shouldn't be sponsored with public funds. Now, banning a play just because it goes against conservatism seems absurd to me. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I'm not in favor of silencing anyone. But society also needs to understand that sponsoring something with taxpayer funds, which includes Democrats, Republicans, independents, requires responsibility. It's different from a private space." The presenter frowned. There didn't seem to be a loophole to unmask Dana in the way she had hoped. The audience could see that, even if they didn't agree with him, his answers were calm and coherent. Alice then decided to go for the final card. "All right, Dana, since you're so keen on freedom of expression, how about we talk about the influence of money on public discourse? Big corporations and Republican billionaires fund campaigns and advertisements that shape popular opinion. Isn't that also an imbalance of power?" Dana uncrossed her arms and leaned forward again. "And don't billionaire corporations and liberal celebrities do the same? I don't see the difference. If you want to talk about economic power shaping narratives, there's no innocent side here. The point is, people have the right to financially support the causes they defend. The Supreme Court has already ruled on this. We can even discuss limits, but isn't curtailing the right to sponsor ideas, by any chance, interfering with freedom of expression?" Some applause came from Republicans and conservatives in the audience, who until then had been restrained. Alice, with a tense smile, concluded, "Ladies and gentlemen, that interview showed why Dana White is so controversial. He defends freedom of speech, but many claim that his views help perpetuate the inequality of voices. It's up to you, the viewer, to judge who's right. Thank you, Dana, for coming on Late Night with Alice Robinson." Dana thanked her, shaking Alice's hand again. "Thanks for the space, Alice. And may we all continue to speak freely, because it's only through more dialogue, not less, that we'll reach any consensus." The program ended with a round of mixed applause. Some gave a standing ovation, others were openly upset. But overall, that night would go down as one of the most evenly matched confrontations Alice Robinson had faced on stage. She hadn't managed to humiliate her guest like in so many other interviews. Dana White had turned the tables, shining a spotlight on the contradictions of the cancellation culture and the idea of freedom of expression defended only when convenient. Behind the scenes, there was a tense atmosphere. The chief producer, Richard Campbell, a tall man with grey hair, approached Alice, who looked frustrated. "Alice, it was a good interview, but I feel you lost control at certain points." "I know, Richard," she replied, shaking her head. He managed to dodge every onslaught, turning my arguments into a discussion about the hypocrisy of the liberal mainstream media. I didn't expect such resourcefulness. "Perhaps you underestimated him, and he's quick to reason. He doesn't get carried away by easy provocations." Alice sighed, looking at the cameras, which were now turned off. "Yeah, he didn't come out with any overtly offensive phrases that I could use against him. I'm going to have to edit this material very carefully." Meanwhile, in the dressing room, Dana was collecting her things. It was then that John Harrison appeared, a political aide who worked for a Republican senator from the region. John was dark, thin, and wore thin-framed glasses with a shrewd look on his face. "Dana, congratulations on the interview. You handled Alice's provocations very well." Dana shrugged. "I only spoke my mind. I don't think we should shut up or hide. If we believe in freedom of expression, we have to be ready to defend it against even the harshest criticism." True, many Republicans feel that they are ridiculed and ignored by the big channels. Today, you gave them a voice. I've received several messages here on my cell phone, including from people who say they're thrilled. Dana arched his eyebrows in surprise. Although he was used to dealing with fans in sport, he hadn't expected such an impact. "I'm glad, but I didn't do it to get applause. I did it because I believe in this cause." 2 weeks later, social networks were still buzzing with excerpts from the interview. Montages, memes, and discussions were multiplying, both from Dana White's supporters and from critics who still considered him an extremist conservative. Curiously, some liberal commentators admitted to seeing, for the first time, a certain coherence in Dana's defense, even if they disagreed on several points. Smaller news channels, with audiences more inclined towards the Republican Party, began to invite Dana to new debates. He gave a few interviews, but didn't extend himself too much, preferring to let the conversation generated by that night on TV take its own course. On one of these programs, when asked how it felt to become a new spokesperson for freedom of expression, Dana simply replied, "I don't want to be a spokesperson for anything. I want people to understand that it's not a question of left or right, but of letting everyone speak without fear. An environment of open discussion is the basis for finding real solutions." It wasn't all flowers, though. He also received insults. He was called a hypocrite, a fascist, and even a false bastion of freedom. On one occasion, a liberal digital influencer let loose. Dana White is nothing more than a sports businessman who thinks he's a political philosopher. You want to talk about freedom, but you profit from fights sponsored by Republican billionaires. What a joke! Dana just laughed when he heard the comment. He wasn't easily rattled after all. He was used to dealing with provocations in the ring world. He told anyone who would listen, "I don't get into personal insult fights. Anyone who wants to discuss ideas, I'm open to it. Otherwise, I won't waste my time." The truth is that as the days went by, the interview became a landmark. Many Republicans felt represented by Dana's stance. Others, more liberal, began to reflect on whether freedom of expression was really being used selectively. At the end of the day, that night in Charlotte left a profound lesson. It's not because we have strong political convictions, be they Republican, Democrat, or any other strand, that we should silence the voices of those who think differently. Freedom of expression exists precisely so that society can evolve through the clash of ideas. Closing the doors of dialogue or personally attacking those who disagree with us only creates more barriers, more bitterness, and less understanding. Alice Robinson experienced firsthand the power of an honest conversation in which she tried to humiliate, but ended up meeting someone who stood firm in their convictions without falling into empty aggression. And Dana White, with his direct and courageous stance, showed that, even in the heat of deep disagreements, it is possible to sustain mutual respect, something that many forget in times of extreme polarization. At the end of the day, every citizen needs to make the effort, to listen before reacting, to seek to understand before labeling, and above all, to remember that public debate only has value when it is guided by compassion, empathy, and respect. After all, these are virtues that transcend any political label and form the basis of a truly free society.